Get
The
in the
slap
car.
came
Stop
first,
resisting.
loud, sudden,
Move it.
and
Let's go.
humiliating, snapping her head sideways before she even understood what was happening. The force of it exploding across her face as rain-soaked streetlights blurred into streaks of yellow and blue. And before she could regain her balance, a second officer shoved her hard in the chest, sending her stumbling back against the cold steel of a patrol car, the impact stealing the air from her lungs as pain rippled through her ribs. "Don't get smart with us," one of them barked, already angry, already convinced, his hand gripping her jacket like she was something dangerous simply for existing. She raised her hands instinctively, palms open, fingers shaking not from fear, but from the familiar, bitter knowledge of how fast moments like this turned deadly. Yet her movement only fueled them. Another slap, harder this time, knuckles catching her jaw, her vision flashing white as the taste of blood filled her mouth. Around them, the street was nearly empty, a forgotten stretch of the city where cracked sidewalks and shuttered stores told stories no one cared to listen to. And that isolation emboldened the officers, their voices sharp, overlapping, feeding off one another. "What are you doing out here?" one demanded, though he never waited for an answer, instead slamming her face first onto the hood, the metal freezing against her cheek as her breath came out in a broken gasp. She tried to speak, to explain that she was simply standing there, that she had committed no crime, but her words were drowned out by the sound of a baton striking her thigh, not hard enough to break bone, just enough to warn her who had the power. This wasn't procedure, it was punishment. A knee drove into her lower back, forcing her down, her wrists wrenched painfully behind her as plastic cuffs snapped tight around them, cutting into her skin. "Stop resisting," someone shouted, though she lay completely still, her body pressed into the pavement, rain mixing with blood near her lip, the irony almost unbearable. She had trained for hostage situations, interrogations, armed suspects. She had stared down men with rifles and calm eyes. But nothing in the manuals ever fully captured this. The way authority could become violence when wrapped in prejudice. The way a badge could turn fear into cruelty. Her mind, disciplined and sharp, cataloged everything despite the chaos. The partial badge numbers. The way one officer avoided the body camera while another seemed too eager to perform for it. The age lines on the sergeant's face that suggested experience without wisdom. She felt another shove, rough hands patting her down far more aggressively than necessary, lingering, invasive, and anger flared hot in her chest, an anger she forced herself to bury deep, because she knew reacting was exactly what they wanted. To them, she wasn't a federal agent with years of service and commendations locked away behind a sealed identity. She was just a black woman in the wrong neighborhood. A problem to be controlled. A boot pressed near her head, close enough to be a threat without words. "You people are always up to something," one officer muttered, low and casual, like it was a fact of nature, not a confession of bias. The rain intensified, drumming against the asphalt, soaking her clothes as she lay there breathing carefully, counting seconds, reminding herself to stay alive, to stay conscious. She thought of the file she had been following, the quiet investigation that had brought her here alone, the reason she couldn't flash credentials without blowing months of work, and possibly her life. The cruelest part was knowing that with a single sentence, 3 letters, this could end instantly, yet experience told her that saying them now, in this moment, could just as easily make things worse. Another officer yanked her up to her knees, forcing her head back by her hair, so she had to look at them, at their uniforms, their weapons, their certainty. Sirens wailed in the distance, back up on the way, tightening the circle. She met their eyes, steady despite the pain, and in that silent stare was a promise they couldn't see yet. They were making a mistake that would follow them forever. Tonight, they believed they were in control. Tonight, they thought this was just another stop, another nameless woman they could rough up without consequence. They had no idea that the ground beneath their boots was already shifting, that the woman bleeding in handcuffs was trained to remember everything, and that when the truth finally surfaced, that she was an FBI agent, they would wish they had never laid a hand on her. They dragged her upright with rough hands, the sudden motion sending a sharp wave of pain through her shoulders as the cuffs bit deeper into her wrists. And for a split second the world tilted, rain and flashing lights smearing together, as if the night itself was dizzy from what it was witnessing. She was marched toward the back of the cruiser, boots splashing through shallow puddles. Her knees weak not from fear, but from the accumulated impact of strikes meant to remind her she had no control here. The back door was yanked open, and before she could steady herself, an officer shoved her forward, her head narrowly missing the doorframe as she stumbled inside, the hard plastic seat unforgiving against bruised muscles. The door slammed shut with a final echoing thud, sealing her into a cage of steel and tinted glass, the air inside thick with disinfectant and old sweat. Outside, their voices carried through the metal, distorted but unmistakably hostile, words like suspicious, noncompliant, and aggressive tossed around casually, rewritten versions of reality forming in real time. She closed her eyes for half a second, not to escape, but to center herself, slowing her breathing the way she'd been taught in far more dangerous situations, reminding her body that panic was a luxury she could not afford. When the door opened again, it was not with restraint, but with renewed aggression. They pulled her back out, apparently unsatisfied with simply containing her, and forced her to stand under the harsh white beam of a spotlight that made her feel exposed, every drop of rain on her skin suddenly icy. A sergeant stepped closer now, older, heavier, his expression one of practiced authority tinged with something darker, something that suggested he had already decided who she was before she ever spoke. "Start talking," he said flatly. "What are you doing here?" She answered calmly, choosing every word with care, knowing that anything too confident could be twisted, anything too quiet labeled suspicious. "I'm waiting for someone," she said, which was true, just not in the way they imagined. The response earned her another shove, this time into the side of the car, pain blooming along her arm as metal met bone. "Don't lie to us," one officer snapped, his hand hovering near his weapon, a gesture that made her pulse spike despite her discipline. She noticed then how differently they moved around her compared to other scenes she'd witnessed in her career. Less caution, more dominance, like they believed force was not just allowed but expected. Questions came faster now, overlapping, accusatory, each one built on the assumption of guilt. "Where do you live? Who do you work for? What are you hiding?" When she hesitated, only long enough to think, someone struck the roof of the cruiser with an open palm, the loud bang making her flinch despite herself. "See? She's playing games," an officer said, almost satisfied, as if her silence proved something he'd been waiting to confirm. The rain continued to fall, soaking her hair, running down her face like tears she refused to shed, and she wondered briefly how this would look later, on reports and footage edited just enough to justify everything. She caught a glimpse of herself reflected faintly in the cruiser window, cheeks swelling, lips split, eyes steady, and the sight grounded her, reminding her who she was beneath the violence being imposed on her. She had faced criminal interrogations where suspects tried to intimidate her with threats and lies, but this was different. This was the system interrogating her body, testing how much it could take before breaking. The sergeant leaned in closer, lowering his voice, and said something meant only for her, something quiet and poisonous about people like you, always thinking the rules didn't apply. Her jaw tightened, anger burning hot and controlled, because she understood the danger of that sentence better than they ever would. Backup arrived then, another cruiser, more lights, more uniforms, and instead of bringing balance, it brought escalation, each new officer feeding off the story already being told, none of them asking the most important question: what if they were wrong? One of them finally glanced at her phone, now lying cracked on the hood of the car, and scoffed. "Probably stolen," he said casually, tossing it aside like it meant nothing. Inside, she made a decision, not to reveal herself yet, not to save them from their mistake, but to let the process continue just long enough for it to expose itself fully. Because she knew something they didn't. Every second, every word, every unnecessary shove was stacking up, building a case far more dangerous to them than to her. As they moved to put her back in the cruiser, tightening the cuffs again as if punishing her for surviving this long, she looked up at the dark sky and thought not of revenge, but of accountability. They believed this night would disappear into paperwork and routine. They had no idea it was being burned into memory, hers. And that soon, very soon, the balance of power would shift in a way they could no longer control. The street seemed to shrink around her as they pushed her against the cold metal of the patrol car again, rain sluicing down her jacket and soaking her hair, making the night feel heavier, almost suffocating. Each officer's face was etched with certainty, a belief that they were upholding law and order, and each movement, every shove, every jab of an elbow, every bark command, reinforced their authority in a world that had never taught them to question who wielded it. "Turn around," one ordered sharply, pressing a gloved hand against the small of her back, and when she obeyed, her wrists burning from the tight cuffs, he slammed her forward onto the hood, making the impact echo across the empty street. She bit back a gasp, pain exploding across her ribs, but her mind didn't flinch. She catalogued everything, as she always did. The officer's impatience, the slight tremor in his hand, the way the younger one kept glancing at the camera, nervous and uncertain, as if he already sensed the story might spiral out of his control. Another slap landed across her cheek, open-handed, raw, meant to humiliate and assert dominance, and the taste of copper filled her mouth, mingling with the rain and the grit of the street. Her voice rose, calm but measured, even as the fury in her veins coiled tighter. "I'm not resisting," she said firmly, though they either didn't hear or refused to believe her. One of them leaned closer, sneering, a mixture of suspicion and disdain painting his features. "Sure doesn't feel that way," he said, pressing his forearm against her back, forcing her further down, until her knees scraped the wet asphalt. She stayed still, measured her breathing, forcing her body to obey discipline over instinct, though the instinct to fight, to neutralize, to turn the situation in her favor, was screaming like a coiled spring. Their hands roamed with unnecessary aggression, frisking her jacket, patting her down with a lingering, invasive persistence, as if the fact of her existence demanded suspicion and humiliation. She thought of the case she had been following, the evidence she had been so careful to protect, and a quiet anger rose alongside a cold, precise determination. This would not be forgotten, and it would not go unpunished. As another officer approached with a flashlight, probing her face and body in ways that were meant to intimidate, she caught a reflection in a nearby puddle, the red and blue lights cutting jagged stripes across her swollen face, and she allowed herself a single thought: they are about to learn the wrong person is in their grip. They didn't see her for who she was, an agent trained to endure, to observe, to survive, and to strike with precision when the time was right. One officer muttered, perhaps to himself, perhaps to his partner, "I don't know why she's acting like this," while another added, "Probably a thief or worse." The language stung, not because it was untrue in their eyes, but because it revealed the bias baked into their actions, a belief that any black woman could be assumed guilty until proven otherwise, a presumption of danger that ignored reality entirely. She felt the cuffs tighten, the cold metal gnawing into her skin, and let a small, invisible smile curl on her lips, not for them, but for the reckoning they had no idea was coming. A sergeant now stepped closer, looming over her with a mixture of authority and impatience. "We're taking you downtown," he said, voice low, almost venomous. "Maybe a night in the cell will straighten you out." The threat hung in the rain-heavy air, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she filed every detail away, the words, the tones, the gestures, the weight of their assumptions, as a mental record that would last far longer than the night itself. They were moving her toward the cruiser again, two on each side, her body pressed and prodded, shoulders aching, jaw tight, when she finally allowed her eyes to scan their badges, the numbers, the names. Every note she made, every observation, would one day unravel the arrogance of this moment. The younger officer, still nervous, looked at her with fleeting doubt, a hesitation she noticed immediately. That pause, that tiny crack in their armor of certainty, was a small victory. Inside, her mind ran through every possible scenario, every tactical move she could execute once they revealed her identity. But for now, she remained compliant, a perfect picture of submission, letting them believe their own narrative, knowing that the moment of truth would come soon, and it would be catastrophic for them. The rain fell harder, each drop a drumbeat of inevitability, and as they finally shoved her into the back of the cruiser, she let her body settle just enough to survive the ride. They had no idea that the black woman they had assaulted, humiliated, and misjudged was not just an innocent bystander. They had no idea she was an FBI agent, trained to notice every weakness, every error, every lapse in procedure. And when they realized it, the fallout would be swift, precise, and undeniable. But for now, she sat silently in the dark, wrists raw, body aching, cataloging every violation, every misstep, every prejudiced assumption, knowing that patience was her greatest weapon, and their ignorance her strongest ally. The back of the cruiser was cramped, dimly lit by a single flickering overhead light, rain dripping steadily from her soaked hood onto the hard plastic seat, and the air smelled of wet leather, sweat, and the faint chemical tang of disinfectant. Every jolt of the vehicle made her body ache, wrists burning where the cuffs bit deep into her skin, but she remained silent, calculating. Outside, the officers argued quietly, their voices a low hum filtered through the metal walls, each sentence laced with assumptions about her guilt, her intentions, her presence in the neighborhood. They did not see her as a trained professional, a woman who had spent years in high-stakes operations, a person who knew how to turn violence into information. They only saw the color of her skin, the way her hands trembled, not from fear, but from pain and restrained anger, and the way she had dared to meet their eyes without immediate submission. One officer, younger than the rest, shifted nervously in the front seat, stealing glances at her through the partition, his unease evident in the way his fingers tapped against his thigh. "She's different," he muttered, and another, older and grizzled, waved him off. "Don't overthink it. She's just another suspect. We've seen enough like her before." The younger officer's glance lingered, as if he was questioning something he couldn't yet name, and she made a mental note of it. The small cracks in their armor, the tiny seeds of doubt that would grow once the truth came out. Inside, she flexed her shoulders subtly, loosening the tension without drawing attention, preparing for the moment when action would be unavoidable. The cruiser bounced over a pothole, sending a shock through her bruised ribs, and she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to remain calm. She could have spoken, demanded respect, shown her credentials. But the night had already proven how quickly authority could be twisted into violence, how easily even 3 letters could become irrelevant when prejudice had preformed its narrative. Instead, she observed. She cataloged the patterns of their movements, the tone in their voices, the rhythm of their breathing and speech. Every glance at the radio, every hesitant step, every unguarded whisper would be useful later. Their assumptions, their arrogance, their overconfidence, they were all building a case against themselves. The older sergeant leaned back slightly in his seat, a grimace crossing his face, as if he felt the storm of the night closing in. "We'll process her at the station. Easy in, easy out," he muttered, speaking more to himself than anyone else. But the certainty in his voice was brittle. She could sense it. Their confidence relied on their control, and control had slipped the moment they had used excessive force against her. A woman they did not understand. A woman who was entirely capable of making them regret their actions. She allowed herself a single quiet exhale, letting the tension drain from her body just enough to remain mobile, to remain ready. The cruiser turned sharply onto a narrower street, puddles splashing up along the sides, and she caught movement in the reflections of shop windows. A cat darted across the street, indifferent to the human drama unfolding around it, and she felt a pang of irony. The world did not pause for injustice. It simply flowed, uncaring, forcing those who noticed to act with precision. Her eyes traced the faces of the officers again, noting the micro-expressions, the tiny flinches, the way the older cop's hand hovered near his weapon slightly too often, the younger one's hesitation when issuing commands. Every detail was a thread, every observation a tool. As the cruiser slowed near a red light, one of the officers muttered something dismissive about her attire, her hooded jacket and sneakers, their words dripping with condescension. She held her gaze forward, expression neutral, letting the insult pass without response, because she knew how quickly a single word could be used against her. Instead, she focused inward, on the calm precision that had gotten her through countless dangerous encounters, on the patience that would allow her to turn the night's chaos into leverage. A siren wailed in the distance, a new vehicle approaching, and she noted the timing, the distance, the likely backup forming around them. The officers seemed oblivious to the subtle shifts in their surroundings, blind in their certainty, which made the moment perfect. Her fingers flexed against the cuffs, testing them quietly. while her mind rehearsed contingencies, escape routes, and methods to turn the narrative in her favor once the time came. They did not know, yet, the storm they had awakened. The fact that the woman they humiliated and attacked had the training, the authority, and the tools to make them accountable in ways they could never anticipate. As the cruiser idled at another intersection, rain washing over the city like a relentless drumbeat, she allowed her eyes to soften, to appear weary and compliant, while inside, every neuron hummed with vigilance. They saw a victim. She saw a map, a puzzle, a countdown. Every wrong assumption they made was a step toward the reckoning that would come. And when it came, it would be precise, undeniable, and irreversible. Tonight, the night they believed they controlled, was already slipping from their hands. The station was a harsh fluorescent box of white light, cold and unyielding, with the faint hum of air vents blending into the constant clatter of keyboards, phones, and distant voices. The officers marched her inside like a parade of assumption, their hands gripping her arms with the same rough certainty that had marked the night so far, their boots echoing on the linoleum floor, a rhythmic drumbeat of authority. She remained calm, each step measured, each movement deliberate, her body aching from the blows and holds of the street, yet under complete control, because this was another arena, and she knew how to survive. The hall smelled of disinfectant and faint cigarette smoke, a stark contrast to the rain-washed street outside, and it clung to her soaked clothing, making her even more aware of her isolation, of the way the world had assumed guilt before justice. A sergeant led her into a holding room, the door clanging shut behind her with finality. The space was small, walls painted institutional beige, a single metal chair bolted to the floor, and a surveillance camera blinking down from the corner, as if recording every micro-expression, every flinch, every word. "Sit," one officer commanded, not even bothering to soften his tone, and when she complied, she noted the ease with which he assumed obedience, as if the last hour of shoves, strikes, and slaps had already broken her entirely. She didn't flinch, didn't complain, and let her posture reflect what she knew they wanted to see: vulnerability. But beneath the composed exterior, her mind raced, cataloging every detail. The marks on the walls, the angles of the cameras, the timing of footfalls outside, the way the younger officer's nervous glances betrayed uncertainty in his own authority. Every element was a clue, a thread that could unravel the arrogance of this room. Questions came almost immediately, rapid fire, accusatory, dripping with assumption. "Why were you in that area?" one demanded. "Do you know what time it is?" another pressed. "Are you resisting arrest?" The words were designed to dominate, to provoke, to box her into a narrative they had written long before this night. She answered carefully measured, keeping her tone calm and low, giving nothing more than the minimal truth while revealing nothing of her identity or purpose. "I was waiting," she said simply. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." The room seemed to shrink further at her response, officers exchanging glances as if her restraint was an insult, a challenge to their authority. They didn't see that she was controlling the room, that every word, every pause, every subtle inflection was deliberate, crafted to unsettle them just enough without revealing her hand. One officer leaned across the table, his face twisted in suspicion. "You're lying," he spat, the venom in his voice clear. "I don't know why, but you're hiding something. Don't play games with us." She met his gaze evenly, unflinching, letting a quiet, invisible authority radiate from her posture. In another context, that authority might have been invisible to civilians, but trained eyes would recognize it, the calm, controlled energy that radiates from someone who is confident in skill and law. They, blinded by prejudice and assumption, did not recognize it. Instead, they saw defiance, which only stoked their anger further. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if uncertain whether to continue with the same aggression. He had seen something in her demeanor that made him pause, a subtle but undeniable signal that this woman was not ordinary, that she was calculating and precise. He hesitated, then muttered under his breath, "Maybe we overreacted," the words barely carried. But she caught them, storing them as proof that even among those blinded by bias, doubt could creep in. It was the first real sign of leverage in this room. Another officer reached to grab her arm, a motion meant to intimidate, but she didn't flinch. Her hand, though cuffed, remained poised for control, a readiness coiled beneath the surface. She could have acted in that instant, neutralized the threat, but she waited, choosing patience over impulse. The power was hers, but she needed the moment when revealing it would be undeniable, when the imbalance would be total and irreversible. Their ignorance of her identity was her greatest weapon, and she held it carefully, like a loaded instrument waiting for the perfect strike. Time stretched, each question and accusation a layer in a tension that thickened like smoke in the room. She stayed silent when the officers whispered to each other, when they speculated about her motives, about the neighborhood, about the supposed crimes she might have committed. Each sentence, each glance, each misstep they made was an unintentional admission, building the scaffolding for the truth she would later unveil. And though the cuffs chafed and her body ached, she held still, poised, a calm eye in a storm of chaos, because she knew the night was far from over. Their assumption of control was a trap, one they could not see, one they would not escape once the truth came down like a hammer. She leaned slightly forward, eyes meeting the sergeant's, and in that unspoken moment, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. They had no idea the woman they had beaten, humiliated, and misjudged had the training, authority, and foresight to ensure that their arrogance would have consequences. Tonight, the station might have felt like a cage, but to her, it was merely the first act of a reckoning already in motion. The room had settled into a tense rhythm, the fluorescent light above flickering sporadically, casting shadows that danced across the walls as if mocking the officer's confidence. She sat in the metal chair, shoulders squared, wrists aching from the tight cuffs, yet every inch of her posture radiated discipline and control. The officers shifted uneasily, the younger one glancing at the door repeatedly, the older men exchanging terse, frustrated murmurs. Her silence was a tool, each second she didn't speak increasing the tension, forcing them to confront their own impatience, their own assumptions, their own blind certainty. They had believed that by asserting dominance through violence, by slamming her against metal and asphalt, by humiliating her in front of witnesses and the night itself, they had established control. But control, she knew, was an illusion they had handed to her without realizing it. One officer slammed a fist against the table, leaning forward aggressively, eyes flashing. "I said, what were you doing out there? Don't lie to me." His voice cracked under the weight of his own frustration. The veneer of authority strained thin. She met his gaze evenly, her expression calm, controlled, betraying none of the storm within. "I was waiting for someone," she repeated, tone flat but unwavering. The words were simple, almost innocuous, yet delivered with an undercurrent of quiet authority that made the officer hesitate, a microsecond of doubt flashing across his face before he slammed his hand down again. That hesitation, small as it was enough for her to take mental note. They were beginning to crack, not because she had revealed anything, but because she had made them confront the limits of their assumptions. The younger officer shifted in his seat again, trying to regain composure, and she sensed the flicker of uncertainty in him. He had already seen too much. Her calm under assault, her refusal to panic, the way her eyes catalogued every micro-expression and movement in the room. He whispered something to his partner, barely audible. I think we overdid it." The older officer growled in response, dismissing it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She allowed herself a small internal acknowledgement. Patience was beginning to work in her favor. Outside, the hum of the station continued. The ordinary life of bureaucracy, unaware that the balance of power in this small room was already shifting. Then, as if sensing the growing tension, the sergeant leaned in, voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You think you can play us," he said, sneering. "We've seen this before. People like you think they're smarter than us." She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. She let the words hang, analyzing, processing, knowing that confrontation without control would destroy the advantage she now held. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture that communicated both attention and patience, and let the silence do the work. The officers were unaccustomed to this, a woman not flinching, not pleading, not reacting in fear. It unnerved them, and unease spread quietly, a poison through their certainty. Her mind raced, considering each contingency, calculating each next step. The cuffs were a temporary inconvenience. Her training allowed her to endure far worse. Every misstep they made, every assumption, every display of unchecked authority, was a thread she could pull later to unravel their narrative. The night, brutal and chaotic on the street, had been their mistake, but the station, the controlled environment, the fluorescent-lit cage, was now her stage. She could control the pace, the tension, the revelations. She could allow them to stumble over their own arrogance while she remained composed, patient, untouchable in her quiet authority. Another officer leaned in now, trying to assert dominance by looming over her, hand hovering near his belt as if reminding her of the power he believed he held. She met his gaze directly, unwavering. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken threat, and then she spoke, voice calm but cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You've made assumptions about me," she said slowly, "about why I'm here, who I am. And every one of those assumptions is wrong." She allowed a beat, letting the words sink in. The room shifted. Micro-expressions flickered. Glances darted between officers. The seed of doubt planted earlier had begun to bloom. For the first time, the younger officer visibly swallowed, shifting back in his seat, his earlier unease now mixing with fear, though he didn't yet understand why. She remained silent after her words, letting the room carry the weight of her statement, letting their uncertainty grow. They still did not know her identity, still believed they were in control, yet the tide had begun to turn. She could almost feel it, the subtle tightening of tension, the imperceptible hesitance creeping into their commands, the first real signs that their arrogance was faltering under the weight of her patience and precision. And so she waited, wrists raw, body aching, mind razor-sharp, letting the officer's ignorance and bias tighten the net around themselves. Tonight, she would not strike first, not yet. But every misstep they made, every assumption they held, every aggressive movement, brought her closer to the moment when the truth would land, undeniable, catastrophic, and irreversible. The black woman they had attacked, humiliated, and underestimated was no longer just a victim. They had unknowingly stepped into a game where she controlled the rules. And when she finally revealed herself, the reckoning would be swift, precise, and devastating. The door to the holding room clicked, and a hush fell over the small space, as if the night itself had sensed the shift in momentum. She remained seated, wrists still raw from the cuffs, posture calm and deliberate, yet inside, a controlled storm churned. The officers looked at her with a mix of impatience and lingering superiority, unaware that the balance of power in the room was already tipping. Every shove, every accusation, every slam they had delivered on the street and in the station had only strengthened her resolve, honed her focus, and cataloged evidence for the moment when the truth would strike. Their arrogance, their assumptions, their racial bias, all of it was stacked against them, invisible to their eyes but crystal clear to hers. The older sergeant leaned forward, frustration finally edging into his voice. "I don't like this," he muttered, voice low, almost to himself. "Something about her, she's different. You see it?" he asked the younger officer, who nodded slightly, unable to mask the uncertainty creeping across his face. She noticed everything. The hesitation in their voices, the slight quiver in their movements, the micro-expressions betraying doubt where before there had only been certainty. It was all the proof she needed that the moment of revelation was near. Patience had paid off. They believed they controlled her, but in reality, she had been observing, calculating, and preparing to turn every misstep against them. Without rising, without even changing her tone, she spoke. "I am FBI," she said quietly, each word deliberate, measured, resonant in the confined space. The statement hung in the air like a detonator's fuse, and the room seemed to shrink as their reactions collided with reality. The older sergeant froze, eyes widening as the implications of her words hit him like a physical blow. The younger officer staggered slightly backward, mouth opening, closing, searching for a reply, for some way to reclaim authority that no longer existed. She remained seated, calm, steady, wrists still bound, but unshaken, as if the revelation alone had already reset the balance of power. The weight of the room shifted instantly. The officers who had hours earlier believed themselves untouchable, who had shoved, struck, and humiliated her without a second thought, now realized the enormity of their mistake. Their ignorance of her identity had led to the night's chaos, and now, confronted with undeniable truth, their fear was tangible. The older sergeant's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a radio, unsure how to report this, unsure how to proceed without exposing their actions. The younger officer's gaze darted between her and the door, hesitation written across his face. They were suddenly aware of everything they had done, of how quickly the story could unravel, and of the consequences that could cascade from a single night of violence driven by bias. She uncuffed herself with practiced ease, the metal snapping open with a fluid motion that left the officers staring, uncomprehending. Every movement was precise, efficient, and controlled, a demonstration of authority they had underestimated entirely. "Step back," she said, voice calm but commanding. The words carried more power than any shove, any baton, any slap they had inflicted. And just like that, she moved with fluidity and purpose, positioning herself in the center of the room, eyes scanning each officer for compliance, weakness, and acknowledgement. The room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to her. Every second they hesitated. Every micro-expression of fear, every step backward reinforced her dominance, both legally and psychologically. One of the officers finally spoke, voice cracking slightly. We didn't know, we thought." His words stumbled, failed, drowned in the weight of reality pressing down on the small room. She allowed herself a controlled, slight smirk, letting the lesson settle. Assumptions and prejudice can be deadly, but awareness and authority can dismantle it entirely. "You made assumptions based on nothing but my appearance," she said evenly, each word a scalpel slicing through the arrogance and bias that had fueled their actions. "And because of those assumptions, you assaulted me. That ends now. You will account for everything tonight." The statement was final, unyielding, and undeniable. The older sergeant sank back slightly, the tension in his shoulders betraying relief, fear, and recognition all at once. The younger officer's hands trembled, and the other men stood frozen, realizing the full scope of their error. In that moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the station, as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the reversal. The black woman they had attacked, humiliated, and underestimated was no longer a victim. She was the authority, the reckoning, and the embodiment of every lesson they had ignored. And tonight they would remember it. The aftermath unfolded with a quiet inevitability, the tension in the station finally giving way to controlled authority. She stood tall now, wrists free, voice calm and deliberate, the room itself seeming to recognize the shift. Every officer who had earlier struck, shoved, and humiliated her now felt the weight of accountability pressing down in a way they had never experienced. Their arrogance, born of ignorance and prejudice, had crumbled completely. The younger officer avoided her gaze, unable to meet the eyes of someone whose competence and authority had so decisively eclipsed his own assumptions. The older sergeant, once a figure of intimidating control, now fumbled with reports and radios, his confidence fractured, his every movement cautious, measured, as if he feared that even a misstep could compound the consequences. She addressed the group calmly, her voice cutting through the residual noise of the station. "You will document every action taken tonight, every shove, every strike, every unnecessary use of force. You will explain why standard procedure was ignored. Your report must reflect the truth, not the narrative you told yourselves in the moment." Her words left no room for interpretation. She was not requesting compliance. She was commanding it, and they all understood that failure to follow her directives would carry consequences far beyond internal discipline. This was accountability in its purest form, precise, unavoidable, and legally binding, delivered by the very person whose authority they had underestimated. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, whispers passing between them that carried the weight of admission and guilt. Each knew they had been wrong. Each understood the cost of their assumptions. Each recognized that their bias had nearly created a tragedy. The woman before them, once beaten and humiliated, was now the embodiment of law, order, and the consequences of ignorance. She moved through the room with deliberate authority, checking that documentation was accurate, ensuring that protocols were followed, and observing their reactions closely. Every pause, every nervous glance, was a testament to the lesson they had learned too late. Outside the station, rain had softened to a steady drizzle, washing the streets clean, but leaving the imprint of the night's violence evident in every bruise, every mark, every detail of the officer's shame. She had endured, catalogued, and now commanded the aftermath, transforming the chaos of the street into structured accountability. She reflected briefly on the irony. The same assumptions and bias that had fueled their aggression were now tools in her hands, demonstrating how ignorance and prejudice could unravel under the weight of truth and authority. They had seen her as powerless, yet they had empowered her to correct their errors, to demand justice with precision and control. The younger officer, trembling slightly, finally met her gaze. We understand," he murmured, voice small but sincere, a recognition that went beyond words and touched the core of accountability. She nodded subtly, acknowledging the admission while keeping the authority firmly in her own hands. The older sergeant remained silent, his pride wounded, his understanding deep, forced to reconcile his prior actions with the undeniable reality of the woman he had underestimated. She allowed the moment to hang, letting the lesson sink in fully, ensuring that the weight of this experience would remain long after the lights of the station dimmed. Then, without a word, she turned, moving toward the door with measured steps, leaving the officers to process the shift completely. Their world, once so certain, had been recalibrated by a woman they had attacked without knowing who she truly was. The 3 letters, FBI, had transformed her from victim to authority, from target to teacher, from passive to decisive. Every step she took echoed her control, her competence, and the undeniable consequence of prejudice unchecked. As she exited into the night, the rain washing over her like a cleansing drumbeat, she allowed herself the faintest trace of satisfaction. Justice had not been instantaneous, but it had been precise. The officers, forced to face their errors and acknowledge the power of authority she held, had learned a lesson that no report or training seminar could replicate. She walked into the darkness, soaked but unbroken, a black woman whose strength, skill, and patience had turned a night of violence into a story of reckoning, accountability, and undeniable power. The city around her continued to hum, indifferent to the events that had unfolded within its street station, but she carried the story forward, a living testament to the truth that assumptions and prejudice could never withstand discipline, skill, and the unyielding force of authority. Tonight, they had learned it, and it would never be forgotten.